What we're going to do is you're going to raise your hands, both of them, really high into the air. Also, a very good stretch early in the morning when it's 9 a.m., which I know many of you probably don't get up that early on Saturdays. So keep your hands raised. So you're gonna, is that the highest you can raise your hands? Yeah. So keep raising them. So collectively, we're all gonna just go one, like just a little bit more, just like a few inches more. And so the point of this is that we can all reach a little bit higher on Saturday morning. Okay, all right. So now that we've started that on a good note and technology is sorted out, I tweeted this. This is gonna be a fun talk. I tweeted this because I was so excited, and then my team actually called me out, and they said, well, you actually have to tell a joke then. So here it comes. Okay, that's it. All right, so my name is Kelly Jin, and I'm super pumped to be here to talk to you guys this morning. I think what has been really interesting in my current position is that I turn into a butterfly come January 20th. So if you were going to ask that question, I turn into a butterfly come January 20th, 2017. We are still running very, very fast. So the president just did his South by South Lawn event last week. There's going to be the Frontiers Conference next Thursday, this Thursday actually, in Pittsburgh. So the president is still pushing on a lot of science and technology events. And I work within the Office of the Chief Technology Officer, Megan Smith, for those of you who have heard her speak before. And I also work very closely with DJ Potholes, the very first US Chief Data Scientist. So we're gonna start off today by telling a story, and all good stories start in Boston, which is where I'm from. I actually spent the last 2 years, Boston's not only my hometown, but actually spent the past 2 years in Boston building up the data team there. So the new mayor came in, Mayor Walsh, in 2014, and he was really thinking about how can we make better data-driven decisions throughout local government in Boston. And for those of you who've heard, there are a lot of really cool things that have happened over the past 2 years. I also started when we had the worst winter ever. So I literally started Monday, January 26th. And then for the next month and a half, I had many days off from work. So this is a photo, I believe, of Newbury Street, but things were shut down. So it was a great welcome when I went back to Boston to start work there. When I arrived, there was actually a news article that was talking about this project called SnowStats. So I believe the link is snowstats.boston.gov. You can't actually access it right now because thankfully there's no snow on the ground there, but it actually showed you. So you think about all of the citizens who were stuck at home wondering when are the plows gonna come. You were actually able to log into a website and see how much snow had been cleared in your local area, depending on the street, and just gave citizens a better sense of, you had all of these public works guys out there digging out, but oftentimes there was a huge disconnect between what you kind of like peeked outside and looked through the window and what was actually going on. So this was my premise for joining the city of Boston and City Hall. I was like, wow, they're so advanced and they're doing so many cool things and everything must be really, really great. And it was, to a certain extent. I think for those of you who've worked in government or even in industry, I'm sure there's a good split here, you are faced with a lot of challenges. So what I'm gonna talk about today is not only filling potholes, like the title says, but also then how do we move past those challenges and how do we start thinking about things at a very, very high level, at a federal and national level to connect a lot of these different cities. So oftentimes when I speak to audiences, I always say, I ask this question, like, what are we actually doing, right? As government employees, as public servants, what are we actually doing at the end of the day? And so this marker of improved quality of life, I think this thread carries itself. Whether you're in local government, for those of you who enjoy watching Parks and Recreation, the TV show is very similar to that. And then for those of you who watch some other political TV shows, federal government is not quite that interesting at all. But we are all trying to improve quality of life. I will say that is the common thread of the work that we're doing. This is just a photo from one of the community centers in Boston. I think one thing that is really important for all of you as you go out and you work looking at massive amounts of data is that oftentimes that comes back to one individual, right? You are looking at one record of an individual's interaction with government, right? If you go onto data.gov, you can see a lot of those very public data sets. A lot of cities are also releasing their data through open data portals. And so for me, I'm constantly thinking of, well, that was an interaction. In Boston, we had still population is about 650,000. There are about 17,000 employees of the city. And so I was constantly thinking of my mind, how many of those interactions between employees and with citizens or people visiting the city were happening each day? And how much information did we actually have to track and look at that quality of data? A lot of the work that we're doing is helping government really ask and answer better questions. I look out into this audience and I think that oftentimes, and I myself have struggled with this, you go to an executive or you go to a manager, you go to a leader, and they're just pummeling you with questions, right? Well, like, what about this? Well, you looked at the data and now I have like 1,000 more questions. And to me, that is a marker of success. If you are actually able to go out, do analysis, and have an executive who is constantly pummeling you with more questions. In the case of DJ, that is the President of the United States, is constantly asking him more questions. In the case of working in local government, that is the case of the mayor asking you more questions about what's going on. In the case of industry, I'm sure you're getting asked questions by your CIO and your CFO of not only, okay, you've looked at the data and you're able to say, these are some of my conclusions, but at a higher level, well, then what, right? What are we then able to derive from your initial conclusions? So remember that really cool slide that I showed you that was the dashboard of the snow stats? So I got to Boston, and that was not reality. So this was more reality of what things were like on the ground, which is the mayor had gone to New York City and spoken to Bloomberg. And for those of you who know anything about Bloomberg, you have very, very fancy charts about how the stock market is moving in any given millisecond, right? Things are not the same at the local government level. So this is one of the first versions of the mayor's dashboard. Of the things learned here is, number one, never put a blank screen and a politician together in the same photo, because I will not show you any of the other images, but people photoshopped some other things that the mayor was looking at. So that's lesson number one. But lesson number two, more importantly, even though this is just a black screen with some graphs on it, it was really just built in Google Docs, is that we actually weren't able to get all this data. Right? So the mayor actually cared about a lot of these things. You can't quite read it in the back, but it says potholes filled, graffiti removed, code violations issued, et cetera. These are things that executives and in turn citizens care about, right? Because we're paying our hard-earned dollars into taxes, and what are we actually getting as a result of that? And so this was one of my first lessons of, okay, the mayor has all these questions. We have a lot of questions, but what can we get up and running as soon as possible? So a lot of the work that I am constantly thinking through is that sometimes it just needs to be good enough, and let's get it out the door, let's ship it, let's show it to the mayor and get his feedback, right? Let's not wait 6 months, let's not wait a year to actually deliver out a product in terms of how are we actually doing as a city? And so this is a very, very good example of building something very, very small that gets a lot of interest from both the mayor and the public. This is one of my favorite comics. I don't even know why I stuck it in here, but I really like it, and it's on the board at work. I feel like, to me, maybe some of you are also this like little, like the larger marshmallowy data guy, but oftentimes, right, in different organizations, you are constantly saying, well, okay, you have a hunch. Can we look at the data and can we validate that hunch? Or maybe you have a hunch and we're actually not collecting that data right now. And so a lot of times this kind of interaction, perhaps not this adorable, but oftentimes this kind of interaction is happening within organizations. And so I just wanted to take a brief pause and share that. Starting the dialogue. So I think in my very, very long title, somewhere in there it said data-driven dialogue. And I say dialogue because it is often a back and forth, right? So I've, in my career, always been at this intersection of business, technology, and data. And sometimes it requires a fair bit of translating between the different parties involved, and it all has to start with actually having a conversation. I'm going to talk, I promise I will switch to stop talking about Boston at a certain point. But this is a screenshot of the 311 application. So for those of you who at least live in DC, I'm not aware of the app being used in Virginia. But 311 is basically the number that you call. That's not 911. So if you have an actual service request that you have a question about the city, let's say you're in Washington, DC, or in this scenario, you need a pothole filled, you can actually call a number. And most cities across the US have started to adopt this. So in Boston, you're actually able to take a photo of that pothole. And then what happens is the city worker who fills that pothole actually takes a photo when they're done, and they send it back to you. So you actually know, hey, somebody listened to me in government, right? Oftentimes it's a black box. Somebody actually listened to me, and somebody actually filled it. And we have photo evidence, hopefully, that it was filled. The first time I saw this, I was like, wait a minute, the lines don't quite match up, and it took me a while to wrap my mind around that. But my point here is that this is a great example of dialogue. It is so simply done, right? Let's take a photo, let's send it between individuals. We're able to show accountability. And so for me, on the back end, right, this is then a ton of data that we're then able to access. So the mayor actually, this is version like 10 of the mayor's dashboard, is now able to look at a ton of different metrics all throughout the city of things that he cares about, that his chiefs care about. You're talking about city services, education, public safety. What are people actually doing day to day? And this is something that he pushed very, very strongly. In the upper right-hand corner, you can kind of make out, it says Boston 311. So that application that you just saw, as well as people calling in, that was being updated every 10 seconds. So the mayor was able to see pretty much real time, what are people calling in about? What are some of those major things happening throughout the city? And then of course, if something major is happening, it's like kind of whited out there, any of those emergency alerts happening as well. Picture yourself as like the mayor or the head of any organization, right? It's really, really hard. For those of you who've managed like teams of 10 or 20, it's also really hard. What are people doing, right? How can I be helpful to those individuals? Just getting a finger on the pulse of what's going on is something that people in government struggle with all the time. And so a lot of that has to do with how can you surface that information in a way that they're able to actually digest. And with something that I have constantly been obsessing about is that the ability to tell your story is the ability to get action done, right? To get somebody to actually take action and move forward on something. I have violated all rules of number of words on a slide here, but my point actually here is that there are a ton of issues. You guys can read some of those very easily. There are a lot of things that we face, and if you think about any of these lines here, they not only translate at the local level, they also rise up to the federal level, right? You have a federal agency for public health, Health and Human Services, NIH, homelessness, HUD, right? Education, Department of Education. So all of these issues, what's been incredibly fascinating to me is seeing them at the local level, and then 3 months ago coming back to DC, and saying, holy cow, all these federal agencies are also running at these issues, right? And how can they be effective if they don't have data, if they don't have that much information? And so a lot of the work that DJ and the team have been doing is really on unlocking a lot of that information, whether that is giving that to you as people here, to students to actually do analysis on. A lot of that has to do with how can we get the data into the hands of people who can do something about it. I highlighted the very last thing because when I came back to DC, I actually didn't know what I was going to be working on. There's 1,000 different projects, and for those of you who've worked in government or worked in DC, oftentimes what is incredibly important on the national stage ends up something that you're working on day to day. And so last night, as I was pulling these slides and finalizing them, I said, I'm going to talk about this very last piece because that's what I'm doing. And actually, I'll talk a little bit about my trip to Los Angeles as well this past week. I think I've like this weird jet lag thing where I've just completely dissociated from the 24-hour cycle. So you guys are kind of dealing with the results of that on Saturday morning. All right, so I'm gonna read this. Law enforcement, how do we divert individuals with mental illness away from our jails to the services that they actually need? It's a tough problem. I'm from Boston, so it's also a wicked problem. And what I mean by wicked problem, for those of you who have never heard of the phrase before, is that it is a problem that, think about any of these major problems that public policy, school kids, or political people scratch their heads every single day. They're like, well, yeah, that's a really, really hard problem, right? And so I think of these as wicked problems where oftentimes they're not defined. Oftentimes they are very much connected to other problems, right? If we go back, you can think of individuals who go through our education systems that might then end up in our public, touching our public health agencies, might end up then interacting with law enforcement, right? All of these pieces are interconnected. And so it's not a straightforward problem. We have to be creative about the ways that we actually approach them. All right, so I'm gonna finally talk about what I actually do in DC. So of course, I didn't have enough in Boston. I was like, everything is so easy at the local level, which is not true at all. But I had an interesting conversation with DJ, and DJ, being DJ, is a very convincing individual. And so somehow I ended up 3 months ago at the end of June coming back to DC and really thinking about what can we move the needle on at a national level, fully understanding that there, at the time, was about 6 months left in this administration, right? So what can we actually do? It's kind of a question to be posed. Then I saw this stat in my first week as I was reading through materials. So 11.7 million Americans in 3,100 local jails cost us over $20 billion per year. It doesn't say per year, but it's actually per year. And so it's a huge problem. Huge. Literally. This is a photo of Cook County Jail. Chicago is located within Cook County Jail. It is 96 acres. Like literally we drove onto the jail and then on our way out, we got stuck in traffic. And I was like, are we back in Chicago? And they're like, no, we're still on the jail complex. We're just stuck in traffic because there's so many people who work there. And so we were stuck in traffic for like an hour in this 96-acre complex trying to get back into downtown Chicago. And this is not unusual. So to me, this is one of those moments where you kind of say, holy cow, right? I feel like there's oftentimes we look at, and this happened in Boston as well, you're looking at a data set and someone tells you just a few numbers and you're like, that cannot be right. And then someone then hands you more data and you're like, that is right, but I can't believe it is right, right? So I think a lot of the initiatives that we're working on is in the scenario like this, right? How many people find themselves driving into a jail and then doing a visit? Not many, right? But I think the work that we've been doing is going out into the field and helping to better connect these local level problems with both federal agencies, as well as I spend some of my weekends talking to awesome folks like you so that you understand that these are some of the major issues that we're running through as a country. If I were to ask you what the 3 largest providers of mental health services are, most people raise their hand and be like, oh, they're like hospitals and someplace or like whatever. They're actually our country's 3 largest jails. So that's LA, Cook County, which I just talked about, and Rikers, New York City. Those are the average populations of the jails at any given moment. So you have 19,000 people in LA County Jail, and there's multiple locations of it. For those of you who are interested in watching a bit more about it, CNN's Lisa Ling did a segment about 2 weekends ago. She spent 10 days going and visiting the jails and interviewing the deputies and the sheriffs there, and it was insane, absolutely insane. Like, it's one of those moments where you're like, I would never think I would go to jail, and then you're in jail and you're like, holy cow, like this is something that unless you've gone through this or you work here, you have absolutely no understanding of the issues at hand. So back to my original question, and my answer, which is that these are the 3 largest providers of mental health services. In LA alone, 4,500 people of those on average 19,000 have been diagnosed with a mental health issue. And so right now in our country, at any given moment, we have all of these individuals who are sitting in jail instead of getting the services that they need. Let that sink in on a Saturday morning for you guys. I will compound that with saying that across my earlier slide with the large numbers, of all of the individuals in our local jails, 64% of them have some sort of mental illness, 68% of them have some sort of substance abuse disorder, 44% of them have chronic health problems. It is crazy. And so I promise this will all make sense at a certain point. But there are things being done at the local jurisdiction level. So one of the reasons why I thought this problem was so interesting was because coming from City Hall, I understood that local jurisdictions are running at these all by themselves, right? They have limited resources, everybody's totally taxed. They have to figure out what can they do. And so we were chatting with one individual in Chicago, and she's working on 1,000 different initiatives. These are all incredible public servants, like she might have been Leslie Knope in Parks and Recreation. And I said, where do you go? Where do you have all these issues and you're trying to like unlock the data from your systems, you're trying to connect to people across the country, you're trying to find solutions. Where do you go? And she says, I don't know, I just kind of like Google and see if I can find solutions of like other jurisdictions who have the same issues. And if you go back to that slide that I just talked about, when you know that every single jurisdiction across the country is running at these issues, it shouldn't have to be that way, right? We should do a better job about connecting people. So I will talk about Miami-Dade, Florida. When they actually looked at their numbers, they found that 97 people accounted for $13.7 million in services over 4 years, spending over 39,000 days in different facilities. But of course, for those of you who work at any organization, you know that different departments like never talk to one another, right? So think about this, right? Different counties. An individual might cycle through their jail and then end up in a hospital ER, and then end up in a homelessness shelter, and then end up getting other public health services. But none of those actually talk to one another. So you fall through the gaps, right? And when Miami was actually able to look at the data, they were able to actually identify those 97 people. So they did what arguably is a pretty, it's not arguably, it is a pretty simple data task, right? You pull your people, you pull your people, let's sit at a table and actually compare all of these individuals and figure out who is taking up the majority of our days, our beds as well. So what Miami was able to do is by having those conversations and saying, we're actually gonna do something about it, police have now responded, this was as of last year, police have now responded to nearly 50,000 calls, but have made only 109 arrests. And so the real point of this is that instead of jail, instead of emergency rooms, you should be getting the services that you actually need, right? And the jail population fell because a lot of these individuals, these are all low-level offenses, misdemeanors, but they've been thrown in jail for that. And so they were able to save $12 million a year. It's interesting to me because people who work in the criminal justice system, lawyers, right, public defenders, sheriffs, they all get this, police departments, they all get this because they have to deal with this on a frontline basis every single day. But the rest of us don't. Like, I have had many, many conversations where I've spent about 5 minutes explaining this, and everyone goes, that can't be right. Like, why are we doing this? Right? And so part of this is how do we tell this story? And what do we actually do about it? So we did do something about it. My colleague, Lynn Overman, who is a former public defender actually from Miami, built an initiative around it. It's called Data-Driven Justice. You can actually look this up. The website is live as of end of June. They launched with 67 jurisdictions. We now have over 100, as of last night, 119, and the population is 91 million jurisdictions. So we've been able to convince 119 jurisdictions, no convincing needed. They all raised their hands and said, this is a huge problem, please help us, and please help connect the dots as well. And so, I am talking to an audience of data scientists. So what we've actually been able to do about this is to help better connect resources. So this is a photo. I went to the University of Chicago's Data Science for Social Good program that is run by Rayeed Ghani. Has anybody in this audience gone through that program? Nope. So you should apply. It's an awesome summer program. It's 14 weeks. It's sponsored by I believe the Eric and Wendy Schmidt Foundation in University of Chicago. And in 14 weeks, they worked with Johnson County, Kansas, and were able to identify 200 individuals. This slide says 104. They were actually able to identify 200 individuals who had been cycling through all of these systems and at an absolute minimum cost, costing $250,000 because they were cycling through all of these systems, but no one had actually talked to one another. So they were able to pull law enforcement data, right, in 14 weeks. They were able to pull law enforcement data. They were able to pull EMS data. They were able to then compare that to mental health services data. Again, you guys in the audience, you're like, oh, that's super easy. No one had been doing this, right? No one had been doing this. And so it's been an incredible experience getting these fellows to connect to these data sources and start thinking, okay, what are the ways that we can actually, use our talent, right? Collectively use our talent. I believe I will hurry up a little bit, but I think I'm definitely running over time. Use your talent to operationalize solutions. So I am very passionate about this because if we do our work right, things should change. You should never be building a product, you should never be doing any analysis if you have not had that initial scoping conversation to say, what are you gonna do about it, my results? How are you gonna implement my recommendations? What budget do you actually have for that, right? So a lot of the work that we're doing at the federal level is helping a lot of these local jurisdictions, and a lot of those local jurisdictions are starting to pick that up as well. So that last slide that you saw, Johnson County said, we can only intervene with 200 individuals. Give us a list of 200 individuals and we will intervene. And so that is a lot of what I'm obsessing about is how can we actually operationalize this work. And there's some challenges. There's a lot of challenges, more than this. I think the opportunity is too great. I think Megan Smith, our CTO, oftentimes says, let's do tours of duty, right? Come into government, then go back out into industry. Learn things from both sides. And lastly, talk to people. So this is a photo in Boston. We have this kind of funny thing that happens that when you say we're gonna have a really small meeting with like 5 people, we ran out of, so you can't quite see, but like on like this, imagine like this side of the photo, it is all standing room. So we wanted to convene a conversation in Boston about this very issue, and we invited 5 people who then invited 5 other people, and then we had about 40-ish people crammed into a small conference room. Friday at 5:30 p.m. we got started. Everyone came, everyone stayed. We now have 15 plus jurisdictions that have joined because they all think that this is an issue that we need to be all working on collectively together. Talk to people. So they told me I couldn't actually take photos of my ride-along. So these are photos like before the ride-along. I went out to LA. We were actually able to see how jurisdictions are doing a good job around these issues. A lot of that has to do with co-responder models. So how do we take people who understand how to deal with individuals with mental health crisis and couple them with law enforcement? So I see a few kind of laughs. These are things that I just like could not believe. So there's a gang conference room. And on this side, our team is a little shameless, so we asked for a challenge coin. That is not my collection. I only have 4 challenge coins currently, but these are some of the places that had gone to LA to get training from those police officers because they are really thinking about mental health and how can we do a better job of responding to those individuals. So I know I turn into a butterfly come January 20th. I will not be flying away on a helicopter, which is pretty cool. But you should still come join. So the federal government, beyond this administration, beyond all of the great work that I believe the president has done, has institutionalized a lot of this work. So you have 18F, it's under the General Services Administration. You have the Presidential Innovation Fellows, which got formalized. And then you have a ton of federal agencies as well. I know some folks from Commerce are speaking later today or tomorrow, and they are definitely hiring in the next year. I've chatted with some of the folks there. So usajobs.gov is a great resource to peruse through. There's a whole other question, as I know I am on record, there's a whole other question of how can the federal government do a better job of hiring individuals with all of your skill sets. But I think that is something that is exciting, right? How can we collectively start to define what the role of data science, data scientist in federal government is, and what are the kinds of issues and problems that we should be running after? Thank you, that's it.